Welcome back to Harbour Unboxed. Today we're revisiting the battle between the Core i7-8700K and Ryzen 7 2700X, and I'll be comparing today's data with what I found back in 2018 to see if either CPU has aged better. In addition to that, I'll also be including the Core i7-11700K and Ryzen 7 5800X, so owners of the older Core i7 and Ryzen 7 CPUs can see if the upgrade is worth it. There's really not much more to say about this one, so let's quickly go over the test system specs and then we'll jump right into the results. All CPUs have been configured with 32GB of DDR4 3200CL14 dual rank dual channel memory. Then for the motherboards, for the AM4 platform we have the MSI X570 Unifier, then for the LGA1200 platform the Gigabyte Z590 Aorus Master, and for the LGA1151 platform the Gigabyte Z390 Aorus Ultra, all of which we're running the latest BIOS revision. Then for the graphics card, I'm using the Radeon RX 6900 XT, and all CPUs have been cooled using the Corsair iCUE H150i Elite Caplix liquid cooler. Finally, I've tested 30 games at 1080p, 1440p and 4K, and we'll look at the data for about a dozen titles, and then get into the usual data breakdown. So, let's get to it. I feel like a good place to start is Battlefield 5, since the franchise has often been used for comparing the performance of these very CPUs. In fact, I recall testing the 8700K with the GTX 1080 Ti and pushing up near 170 FPS, and that was pretty amazing at the time. Turns out that was about the limits of this part, as here we were limited to 167 FPS on average, whereas newer processors such as the 11700K and 5800X pushed up over 200 FPS, well over 200 FPS in the case of the Ryzen 7 processor. So it appears as though little has changed here. The 8700K was 17% faster at 1080p, though this time that margin is maintained at 1440p, whereas it did close up almost entirely with the slower GTX 1080 Ti. In fact, it's not until we reached the 4K resolution that the margins are eliminated entirely with the RX 6900 XT. So, for high refresh rate gamers seeking maximum performance, the 8700K still is the better choice, though for most of you the 2700X is still going to be more than adequate. It has to be said that the 2700X also looks a lot more impressive next to the 8700K than it did in my previous revisit video where we used the 10700K, 11700K and 5800X. So while the 2700X might be almost 40% slower than the 5800X, it was just 14% slower than the 8700K. Moving on to Watch Dogs Legion, we find that at 1080p, the 8700K is 19% faster than the 2700X, which is quite a large margin, though it is worth noting that at 1440p this figure was reduced heavily to just 7% and then just shy of 2% at 4K. So for those of you gaming at 1440p, you will be unable to notice the difference between the 8700K and 2700X, especially if you're not using the $1,000 6900 XT. F1 2020 is another game where the 2700X got completely railed by the newer CPUs such as the 5800X and 11700K, but when compared to the 8700K, it's really not that bad. Sure, the 6-core 12-thread Intel CPU was still 15% faster, but that's significantly less than the 41% gain we saw with the 5800X. Anyway, the 8700K remained 14% faster at 1440p, and it wasn't until we reached the 4K resolution that performance was much the same, resulting in a heavily GPU-bound scenario. Microsoft Flight Simulator 2020 is still heavily thread-dependent, and as a result the 8700K still enjoys a handy lead over the 2700X, delivering 21% more performance on average at 1080p and 1440p, though it's worth noting that the Ryzen 7 part does enable slightly better 1% low performance, and of course frame rates were much the same at 4K. Cyberpunk 2077 might have been a game where you'd expect the 8-core 16-thread 2700X to beat or at least match the 8700K, but that wasn't the case as Intel still enjoyed a 13% performance advantage at 1080p, and even at 1440p the 8700K still offered much stronger 1% low performance. Star Wars Jedi Fallen Order is another DirectX 11 title, and here the 2700X struggled quite badly, allowing for just over 80 FPS at 1080p and 1440p. The 8700K still results in heavily CPU-bound performance at these resolutions, but the frame rate is boosted by a little over 20%, and that does make quite a big difference for those of you with high refresh rate monitors. The Call of Duty Warzone performance is interesting because although the 8700K was almost 20% faster when comparing the average frame rate at 1080p, the 1% low performance was much the same. Then at 1440p, there's very little difference between these two CPUs, and that being the case, we see no real difference at 4K. The Intel Core i7-8700K was clearly faster in Death Stranding, offering around 12% more performance at 1080p and 1440p, but with the 2700X pushing over 144 FPS at both resolutions, this isn't a margin that you're really going to notice. It's worth noting that the 2700X also looked a lot better next to the 8700K than it did previously when we focused on the 11700K and 5800X. Shadow of the Tomb Raider is a very CPU-intensive title, especially the in-game village section that we use for testing. Despite heavily utilising both CPUs, the 6-core 8700K was a good bit faster, averaging 132 FPS, which meant it was 23% faster than the 2700X. We saw a similar margin at 1440p, and it wasn't until we hit the 4K resolution that performance normalised. Tom Clancy's Rainbow Six Siege is a game where those playing seriously do like a lot of frames. That said, the 2700X was good for well over 300 FPS on average, and a 1% low of almost 300 FPS. And for even the most extreme players, I feel like that's typically enough. It's also worth noting that although the 8700K was 13% faster on average, the 2700X offered 5% greater frame time performance. The 8700K was stronger at 1440p, but here we're only talking about a 7% margin, so overall they're fairly similar in this title, and again the 2700X looks much better when compared to the 8700K, opposed to the 5800X. Performance in War Thunder was particularly poor for the 2700X relative to the new 8-core AMD and Intel CPUs, but that's not to say the experience was poor. Quite the contrary, in fact, as the game was very smooth and enjoyable at 112 FPS. It's just that relative to the 5800X, it was a little over 40% slower. However, when compared to the 8700K, things do look much better for the old Ryzen 7 part, as here it was only 11% slower. And that margin was seen at all three tested resolutions, as the 2700X and 8700K were the primary performance limiting components in this testing. The second last game I'm going to look at is Hitman, and again, relative to the newer 5800X and 11700K, the 2700X looked quite poor here, trailing by an almost 30% margin. However, when compared to the Core i7-8700K, the 2700X was just 8% slower at 1080p and 11% slower at 1440p, so while certainly slower than the Core i7 processor, the margin really wasn't that extreme. And the last game they're going to look at the results for is World War Z, and I wanted to discuss these results in particular because it's the only example I have from our 30 games tested where the 2700X was actually faster than the 8700K, though only by about a 5% margin. Frankly, that means both CPUs delivered comparable performance, but again, it's really interesting to see given that previously the 2700X looked very poor when compared to the much faster 11700K and 5800X. Okay, so there's a look at a dozen of the games tested. Now it's time to compare the Core i7-8700K and Ryzen 7 2700X across all 30 games, starting with the 1080p data. So let's go do that. For CPU limited gaming, it's quite clear that in 2021, the Core i7-8700K is the faster CPU, delivering around 12% greater performance on average. There's just a single example of the 2700X winning, and the margin is fairly insignificant. On that note, 8 of the 30 games saw a margin of 5% or less in either direction, and typically I do deem that to be a tie. That said, there were 14 games, so almost half of the games tested, where the 8700K was faster by a 15% margin or greater. Interestingly, if we have a look back at my 35 game benchmark data from 2018, we see that on average, using the GeForce GTX 1080 Ti, that the 8700K was 9% faster on average, and then 13% faster at 720p. So those margins are very similar to what we found here 3 years later with a much faster GPU. But getting back to our 2021 data, we see that at 1440p the margin comes down to 7% in favour of the 8700K, and now we're looking at 15 games, so half of the games tested, where the margin is 5% or less. There's a further half dozen titles where we're looking at single-digit margins, and then just 3 where the Core i7 processor was faster by a 20% margin or greater, though admittedly that is a very significant performance increase. Then finally at 4K, performance is very similar across the board, and here the 8700K was just 1% faster on average, thanks to some decent wins in War Thunder and Dirt 5. But overall, we were heavily GPU bound at 4K, even with the 1600 XT, so CPU performance was largely irrelevant here. So that's how the Core i7 8700K performs in 2021 and how it compares to its old foe, the Ryzen 7 2700X. As expected, the aging Intel 6-core 12-thread CPU still delivers exceptionally good gaming performance, and if you are primarily focused on gaming, I imagine anyone using this processor will still be more than happy with how it handles. As I found back in 2018 with my 35 game benchmark, the 8700K is the superior gaming CPU, but depending on your configuration, there may be little to no difference between the Core i7 and Ryzen 7 processors. Back in 2018, I expected that by the time we got to 2021, the 8700K would still be out in front, winning the vast majority of games, and by similar margins to what we saw with the GTX 1080 Ti back in 2018, and it appears I was pretty well correct on that one. Also, as noted in 2018, the only real issue with the 8700K is its upgrade path, with the only way forward being an expensive Core i9 9900K, and that only nets you 2 extra cores, though again the 9900K is more than sufficient for high-end gaming in 2021. Now, you could argue that the Ryzen 7 2700X wasn't a wise investment, given that high-end gamers would probably be looking at an upgrade to the 5800X or 5900X, and neither of which are an affordable upgrade, despite the fact that you do get to keep your high-end X470 motherboard. However, all of that said, beyond 2018, the 2700X did become the more obvious choice thanks to heavy discounts that saw it selling for as little as $160 US by 2020, which is that's an insane price for that part, while the 8700K was still at its MSRP due to the 14nm supply issues. Anyway, I think I'm going to wrap this video up by playing a few minutes from the conclusion of the 2018 content piece, as I feel it really summarized this comparison well and is still relevant in 2021. Okay, so we've established that the 8700K is hands down faster than the 2700X when it comes to gaming. No real shocker there, but it has to be said that it's not a great deal faster. Realistically, at 1080p with a beastly graphics card, you're looking to gain up to, say, 15%. That would certainly be more of the high end, the typical high end, but we often saw gains of 10% or less. So if you're after a no-compromise gaming CPU, the 8700K is clearly it, but what if you want a high-end CPU capable of strong gaming performance and want to save as much money as possible? In that situation, is one of these options better than the other? Well, in terms of pricing, they are very similar. In fact, you could say overall the system and even the platform costs are much the same. The AMD setup might save you $20, making it a few percent cheaper, and that cost shrinks to less than 1% for those building a high-end gaming rig worth around $2,000 US. So what are the reasons why someone might be better off buying the Ryzen 7 2700X system? If you're not just purely gaming and you happen to run some core heavy applications from time to time, then the 2700X might be a better choice, as it is better under core heavy workloads. But let's just stick to the strictly gaming narrative for the moment and throw in a bit of general usage, which the 8700K is better at. And that also means that we're not going to pretend that every second gamer is a streamer, because let's be honest, they're not. That being the case, the 2700X, or rather the Ryzen platform, still has one advantage, and that is future support. AMD will continue to release new processors that support existing motherboards. Even so, I'm not going to pretend like this really matters at the high end, because I think it's fair to say ultimately it probably doesn't. It is true that X470 motherboards will support future CPU generations, while the Z370 boards are likely at the end of the road with nowhere to go. Okay, so let's be realistic about this. If you're buying a Core i7 8700K or Ryzen 7 2700X today, when do you honestly imagine you'll be looking at upgrading that CPU and potentially the platform? In a year's time? I doubt a year, maybe 2 years at the earliest, but it's probably going to be more like 3. I think most of you would probably wait 3 years before upgrading a high-end system, but I could be wrong. But anyway, if it's 3 years that you're going to be upgrading, then you're probably going to want to get a new motherboard anyway in that time. And given that you potentially only invested $150 US in 2018 on your motherboard, and that's based on my hypothetical system costs that we just did, saving that money on a future upgrade, while that would be nice, it's not really going to make a huge difference either. I remember we are talking about high-end systems here, not sort of the budget bangers where every last dollar counts. So I'll admit I'm a bit torn here on which way to go. They're both very appealing, so I guess it is somewhat of a high-class problem. Personally, though, I don't feel that for gaming, and we're talking about exclusively gaming here, that the extra 2 cores of the 2700X is going to get it ahead of the 8700K in the next few years. So the allure of that glorious 5 GHz overclock would probably suck me in. Again, a really tough choice here, but purely for gaming, I'd get the Core i7 8700K. So there you have it. The Core i7 8700K was and still is the better gaming CPU. But of course, AMD did provide some pretty heavy discounts on the 2700X, and that swung things back in AMD's favor. And that's the reason why so many of you ended up with the 2700X. Anyway, that is going to do it for this video. If you enjoyed it, give it a like. You can also subscribe for more content. There'll probably be a few more CPU and GPU revisits, but we also have a few new products coming up next month and the following month, so there'll be a lot of new stuff to look at as well. Also, we have Floatplane and Patreon, so you can become a Hardware Unboxed community member. We'll get you access to live streams with Tim and myself, Discord chat. We have a really cool Discord server for Hardware Unboxed members, behind the scenes content, and Q&A. So a lot of cool stuff there if you're interested. Check it out, links in the video description. Also, we do have a second run of our Hardware Unavailable merch. Very cool stuff. So if you're interested, again, link for that is in the video description. But if not, perfectly fine. And I would like to just thank you for watching this video. I'm your host, Steve, and I'll see you again next time.